Thank you so much, Quinn, for introducing everyone to this session. And I'm just going to really briefly go over who the panelists are. The panelists we have today are experts on this issue. One of them is Polly Crozier with GLAAD, a staff attorney at GLAAD. And we also have Denise Crooks, founding member of LGBTQ Action Rhode Island and Rhode Islanders for Parentage Equality. And we also have Anna Ford, member of Rhode Islanders for Parentage Equality. So why don't we get started with hearing from Anna. I just want to ask Anna a little bit about how all of this began. So I'm interested in how this effort to make parentage law more equal was deeply personal for you, for your family, as it was for many of us. But for you, what holes did you notice in the law, and how did that impact you?
Thanks, Julie. Welcome, everyone. Some of these faces I haven't seen in a little while, and I see a lot of new faces, and it's really exciting to be here on this side of it. Man, we've worked really hard for this. I don't know if I qualify as an expert. The other panelists are. I just have a very personal story to share with you about my family's experience, and then the others will be able to beef that out a bit more and give you more of the information behind it. But I just want to share some of my family story so that you know where we've come or how far we've come. So yeah, to get started, the frame of reference, we tried really hard to get pregnant. We went to so many IVF cycles, name it, we tried it. I wasn't able to get pregnant. We tried that for 3 years. And we finally got pregnant with my son, Eli, who was born in December of 2016. And the only other background, to keep this brief, is that Eli, we are medical professionals and generally fastidious people by nature. And we met with a lawyer ahead of time. We drew up paperwork. We had intentionally not gotten married, thinking we were fully informed. We've both been married in the past. It was a personal choice. And so Sarah and I just decided not to be married, and we thought that that would be okay, and it turns out it wasn't. Every single IVF appointment, anyone who's gone through IVF, there are consents for everything, and you renew them every year. It must be 30 consent forms every year. We had so many consents and legally binding documents for the embryos, but not a single one for the baby that was born. So you're talking a huge gap right there in our infrastructure in the law. So when Eli was born in December, I carried. I mean, we were just over the moon ecstatic about this. And Sarah, my partner, she handpicked the team that was in the room, and we were just so happy. And as we were, thankfully everyone was healthy, and as we were getting ready to leave the hospital, we had a form we needed to fill out, and you'll be hearing more about this in a bit, but it's called a VAP, Voluntary Affidavit of Parentage or Paternity. So what we realized is, because we weren't married, Sarah was not allowed to fill that form out. And ultimately, this single form, this single piece of paper, is the thing that allows the hospitals and the powers that be, simply put, this is what creates your birth certificate. And from your birth certificate trickles down every single legal document you can think of. You start, like your little person that just came out starts with a birth certificate, and from that, name it. Everything, proof of everything and anything under the sun is going to come from this birth certificate. This is why the VAP is so important. You need to get this piece of paper right, because from that comes your birth certificate. And from your birth certificate, that's how you exist on paper to the rest of the world. Okay? So people who know more than I do will speak more about that. But the point is that Sarah was not allowed to fill it out because she's a girl. If I had been by myself pregnant, coming in to deliver, and I had picked up a guy off the street, brought him in and said, he's the father, no questions asked, because he identifies as a boy, he easily could have been signing that piece of paper just because I said so, no proof necessary. He could have become the legal father to my child, regardless of biology, but because she was female, identified as female, she was not allowed. What's even crazier still is if she had an M on her driver's license, if she identified as male, she could have filled out that form. But because she identified as female, i.e. in a homosexual relationship, she could not be on that form. This was mind-blowing to us as healthcare professionals who thought we knew, woo, we're so smart, we know what's going on, and we're gonna be treated fairly. No, it was really a problem. And so Eli went home, not only, he had to go home with my last name, which was not the plan. The plan was to go home with Sarah's last name. And Sarah had no legal rights to Eli. What this means is that she was literally an invisible entity on paper. It's as if Sarah didn't exist. She, in our case, not only was she an equal part in every stage of our IVF, conceiving and being there and caring for him and being like absolutely my partner in this process, but she actually was biologically the donor. So she provided the egg, being that I couldn't. So she provided the egg. So it was biology, but the point is the biology shouldn't matter. You should have two parents. These parents say they are planning to, you know, be the parents. They've established themselves as being the parents. They should be able to both be on that. But we weren't allowed to do that. Now, as a trauma nurse at the time, the idea of Eli not having a second parent, I was a single parent on paper, and I deal with car crashes, or at the time I dealt with car crashes all the time. This was an incredibly stressful, scary time. And when we should have been bonding with our son, we were spending a lot of time just trying to figure out how to keep him safe, how to get this worked out. We were hitting a lot of walls. They kept being like, we kept getting, the question we kept getting in the middle of this time was, well, why aren't you just married? And it's like, well, thanks for that. But, first of all, being married is not actually the litmus test for who's going to be a good parent. Let's look at those marriage stats out there. 1, right? Don't get me started. But 2, also, man, if she were a guy, she wouldn't have been asked to be married, right? So let's just keep the standard the same. So it just continued to unravel, and we just continued to be blown away that this is the way this works. We look at their laws, we start educating ourselves. Our family laws date back to 1979. There is literally nothing in the verbiage of our laws that covers any products of IVF. It doesn't even speak of IVF, right? So IVF started in the 70s. Last family law was updated in 1979. It doesn't even speak to surrogates, to any type of babies, families that are the product of this kind of technology. And we were just like, okay, it's time for a change.
And you reached out, right, to your state rep. You reached out to your
yes,
to your
thank
state
you.
rep.
So we were like, how do we do this? We are not like, we don't have any political background. How do we get involved? So we reached out to our representative McEntee, who's our representative down here in Narragansett, and she ended up getting that ball rolling. And that very first time we stood up there, it was just Sarah and I trying to explain this injustice, and not like it felt like, I describe it to people, it felt like this tiny, tiny spark that we were putting out there into the ether, and it was like just dark. And we were like, this matters, and we couldn't figure out how to make it take off, but all we knew is it was wrong. And my body, we were like, he was 4 months old or something when we stood there, and my body was still healing. I had a really long labor, and it just felt like, how could we make this take off? And then the right people, these brilliant people you're about to hear from, just ended up making it happen. But that's how this started on our end. And there was other things in the works from other people who already knew that this injustice was happening. But for us, this is how it started and how we started to make a stink about it. There's a lot more I could talk about in terms of the process that we went through, but I know our time is brief. So if anyone has questions too, please ask me, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Thank you so much, Anna. And so we find ourselves, in Anna and Sarah and Eli's story at the point where change is needed, change is necessary. So I want to turn to Polly and ask Polly if you could just fill us in. What was the change that was necessary? What is the Uniform Parentage Act, and why was it the solution that people like Anna and Sarah and Eli and other families like that really needed?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Anna, for telling your story, which was truly like a spark. You were a spark, and then it snowballed into this kind of inevitable push for change, because you're just one story in what was, I think, uncovered through this effort of some really serious harms happening for many families in Rhode Island, because Rhode Island's parentage law was very old, based on a 1960s version of the Uniform Act that's been repealed, and only Mississippi and Kentucky had laws that were that outdated. So the laws, and there were really significant holes. The laws were gendered. The laws didn't have any protections for children born through assisted reproduction, no protections for children born through surrogacy or people involved in the surrogacy process, and just left a lot of kids vulnerable. So the Rhode Island Uniform Parentage Act, it's based on, in fact, two statutes, the Vermont Parentage Act and the Uniform Parentage Act of 2017, which really aim to say, okay, we have to make our laws constitutional after Obergefell and Pavon versus Smith to make sure that LGBTQ families and their children have equal access to the protections and the security of legal parentage, right? Because we want every child to have the security of legal parentage, because legal parentage is a core relationship for a child from which every right and responsibility and every public benefit and inheritance rights and decision-making flows. So the Uniform Parentage Act really updates us, the 2017 version, and makes sure that every child has a path to legal parentage, right? There's protections. It just clearly lays out, here's how you can become a parent: through birth, through a presumption, through acknowledgement, through adjudication, through ART, through de facto parentage, through surrogacy. Let's lay out all the paths. Let's make sure they're gender neutral. So it doesn't matter what the gender of your parent is, or the marital status of your parent is, or the circumstances of your birth. We're going to lay out the paths and the clear standards so that everybody has access to the courts to establish the security of that core relationship. So I have to say, I applaud Rhode Island for going from 0 to 100. It was really an important advance. And the purpose, again, is to really level the playing field for all children.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Polly. So why don't we turn to another member of RIPE, Rhode Islanders for Parentage Equality, and let's turn to Denise and get your perspective on the legislative process. So you were really involved in this effort as a parent, as a member of LGBTQ Action Rhode Island. Could you just give us some background on what is RIPE and why was RIPE critical in bringing about this change?
Sure, thanks. So I found out this was happening, that there was going to be the first hearing back in the spring of 2018 on this in the House at the State House, and I was going to be there for another bill that that LGBTQ Action Rhode Island was working on, and that was a respect and death bill, and the Uniform Parentage Act was being heard. And at the time, I was pregnant with my second child, who I'd conceived through artificial insemination. and I'm married to a woman, and our kids were born after we were married, so her name's on the birth certificate. But that doesn't necessarily fully protect you, because a birth certificate isn't given necessarily the same level of respect if you cross state lines as a declaration of adoption. And so what we probably should have done by now is, having gone through this extensive process of a second parent adoption. In Rhode Island, the burdens around that were really high. People had to get background checks. You had to have a social worker come and do a home visit in your house. You had to answer tons of questions. It was also really expensive. And so we hadn't done it, and had really kind of just been keeping our fingers crossed, and knowing that that left, it left my kids at risk, and my wife, as I said, if I was like a horrible person and divorced her, took the kids and moved to a state that maybe wasn't as respectful of LGBTQ families and rights, there's a possibility that I could have tried to challenge her ability to have custody and appropriate rights to our kids. And that's not going to do that, but that would be awful all around. So when I saw that this was being heard, and I was already going to be there for another bill, I testified on this. And it didn't, that first year, there was like a handful of us there testifying on the bill, and a couple of members of LGBTQ Action Rhode Island, a couple of parents who happened to have heard about it. I think Polly was there. And then it didn't move over to and get heard on the Senate side. So then the next year, LGBTQ Action Rhode Island kind of was like, all right, we'd like to organize around this, and what can we do to sort of build some momentum and get the word out about this happening, and trying to have lobby days and getting people to go to the State House and speak directly to legislators on the floor of the House and the Senate and say why it mattered. And we brought our kids, and I wore my baby there, and was like, so they had to be looking at my baby, who's legal parentage wasn't established, and they needed to get this passed. And it looked really good, and we thought we were maybe going to get it through. There was good momentum, and it didn't quite happen in 2019. And so then we were like, all right, how do we regroup? And Wendy Becker, who I think is on this, suggested that maybe we needed to form an additional coalition that was just specific to this issue. And so while LGBTQ Action Rhode Island continued to support it, Rhode Islanders for Parentage Equality came together. And so that brought together lots of parents and families that were impacted by this. And then we started collecting all of the different healthcare organizations, the medical professional organizations that said this matters, as well as government offices like Vital Statistics and Child Support that said this is an issue that needs to get sorted out. And we increased our social media presence, and then we started getting very strategic in terms of the testifying at the hearings on making sure we had every aspect of who was going to get impacted by this law and had everyone represented. So that was sort of the general effort for this past 2020 legislative session. And it was a lot of work, and it was also a lot of fun in some ways. I mean, we spent a lot of Sunday mornings in Wendy Becker's living room, strategizing while snacking and having sort of brunch, and building community around this shared concern and issue and passion for fixing this.
Thank you so much, Denise. And you mentioned the importance of creating a broad coalition. And I just wonder, well, are there other ingredients for success that you want to comment on there?
I think, and again, I think some of this comes from probably Wendy's many years of experience around doing LGBTQ policy advocacy within Rhode Island. But I think people were allowed to take ownership of different pieces of it. Some folks were like, yeah, I'll handle the social media. Some are like, I'm designing the t-shirts. Some are going to write the op-eds. Some are like, there was really, I think, having that consensus-based, playing to our strengths sort of piece about it, as well as, we were very thoughtful about how to, really use our personal stories as well as our adorable children strategically to kind of make this happen. And then just really just brainstorming and thinking, who else has a stake in this, and how can we, who has and especially in Rhode Island, who has a relationship with that stakeholder or can get to somebody close so that we can kind of hopefully pull them in and get their support.
Right, exactly. So
I was going to say, it was pretty notable to have all those strollers lining up the marble hallways of the State House and the babies echoing. It was memorable.
And you remember the time, I think the now organized pizza and childcare in the bell room. I mean, it was really a lot of families. Yeah, it was really beautiful.
Absolutely. And Denise, I want to, before we turn to Polly, Denise, I wanted to just ask you one more thing, because, you know, when COVID-19 hit, reality changed for a lot of us. But your family was hit in particular, and I want to just ask, what was the impact of COVID on your family as you were trying to get this bill passed?
Sure. So I think one thing was, as soon as that hit, we were like, wow, we thought we had all this momentum, right? But now who knows? I mean, how is this going to be a priority? What does legislating look like? We can't lobby in the same way and all of that. And we weren't sure, despite everyone sort of supporting this, if it would just get shoved to the side because there were other priorities. So that was like general, but for my family specifically, my wife is an emergency medicine doctor. She contracted COVID at work pretty much right as the lockdown happened. And so then I became sick with it and our kids did as well. And so we were, it was pretty scary. The kids' cases were pretty mild. My wife and I were very ill. We didn't end up hospitalized, but we had conversations where we were like, are we going? What are we doing? Throughout it. And, you know, at one point we were definitely, I ended up calling my youngest sister, who had previously, you know, agreed to take the kids if anything happened to the two of us. And I was like, I need to revisit this. You still on board? Like, we're, you know, checking our oxygen levels constantly, for just weeks. And so that, you know, we definitely were sitting there and thinking about the legal piece to that, and the, right, what if I die? There's just Elena, and we haven't secured, you know, really formally secured her legal connection to the kids. And so it very much highlighted the importance of this being a process that can happen smoothly and as close to when the baby is born as possible, and not with this pile of barriers and hoops, expensive and onerous and miserable hoops to jump through. So yeah, and she ended up kind of writing and sharing that story, and thinking about the fact that she, as you know, in her role regularly throughout the surge in the spring, and continues now to have these end of life sort of conversations with folks in the ED because of the pandemic. So.
Absolutely. So it really brings home the importance of having that legal tie, how scary that is. And I just want to recognize Rep. Kassar is jumping in the chat. Thank you so much. Making a comment here about legislators responding to the kids. And that's really important, because I think a lot of times the advocacy work happens, but you don't really know how it's being received on the other side. So thank you so much for that comment. And I want to just move now to conclude our discussion, the panel discussion portion of this session. I want to bring it over to Polly. So let's just hear from Polly about what people should know about the new law, what families should expect. You know, are there key provisions you really want people to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to thank the rep too. Thank you so much for coming. And I have to say, it was a really great process last year, and thank you for your support. And, you know, if you have any thoughts for folks, or words you want to share first about how folks can get involved in the legislature, particularly this year with COVID-19, is there anything you want to share with the group?
Thank you, Polly. And I'm really so grateful for everyone's work on this legislation. This literally was one of the ways in which we saw the sausage get made. And most people are right. You don't want to watch it. And so we ended up, I think what we learned is that broad coalition works. I mean, we've known for years, but you keep assuming that people will either follow their moral compass or make their legislative votes based on the evidence, but that is not the case always. So we need to mobilize. And I have to say that, so my children, who are now 20 and later this month, my youngest will turn 18, which seems impossible. They were colicky children, like extremely, like we couldn't go to the grocery store. So all of you who brought your babies to the State House, I just had this like well of empathy and just knowing that at any moment somebody could pop off and have one of those moments that I tried to avoid as a young parent. But I think there's both the blessing and the challenge of having people come to the State House, that the idea that we required families to bring their babies at bedtime to testify was horrifying to me. I felt like it showed many ways in which we cause families to be disengaged, and so many of our bills really relate to working families and young families, and how disengaged we make them as a result of how we run our State House. On the other hand, the idea that people would bring their babies and their children to the State House was just so fabulous, because I thought, this is a generation of children who will know how to be activists. They will understand that they are welcome in the places where the decisions are getting made. So it showed the best and the most challenging pieces, but I'm just so grateful for the work that was done. And I'm always happy to talk to people about how to engage. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Sorry for that sidetrack. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Polly.
So back to the law. All right. And I'm sure this will hopefully be the first of many conversations, and we'll have resources. And obviously this is a 50-page law. We're not going through that all tonight on a Friday afternoon, but I'll give you just some of the highlights. And again, encourage everybody to stay in conversation with GLAAD, with RIPE, and know that there are so many resources out there, because we really want this law to succeed. And I know I've been working very closely with the Child Support Office and with Vital Records, who are so committed to making this launch right. And actually, I was supposed to bring the most up-to-date VAP form to preview with you all. And of course, I forgot to tee it up, but they are really working hard to be ready. And in fact, I was involved with training the hospital workers yesterday, who will be kind of on the front lines of some of this work. And they're working very hard to be ready, and they're excited. They're ready and they're excited for it. So in any event, so a few of the key provisions of the law, right, that I think are particularly close to my heart, and I think particularly important to the LGBTQ community, is the voluntary acknowledgement of parentage that Anna talked about. So what that is that it's a simple form that the federal government requires every state to have, and it's usually signed by a genetic father to establish parentage at birth. To say voluntarily, I'm taking this responsibility at birth. It's signed one form. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to pay any money. And it is the equivalent of a court decree of parentage. So it's a very important protection that people can sign to establish their parentage at birth. So now with the Rhode Island Uniform Parentage Act, there's expanded access to that path to parentage. So people who are presumed parents, so that includes marital parents, people who have children through assisted reproductive technology, they can sign, in addition to alleged genetic parents, sign that VAP form to be established as a legal parent. So that's, I think, one of my favorite parts, right? And I'm going to be talking about VAPs forever, the most boring form in the world, so powerful, so important to sign, to take, and also a very weighty document, right? You only sign that document if you are truly a parent and you are ready to take on those responsibilities of parentage, because once you're past 60 days, you cannot rescind it, you cannot get out of it. It is a very important legal document. But that's one of, I think, a really important expansion to Rhode Island law, a very important access to justice issue for folks. The bill also clarifies that for the first time in Rhode Island law, that a gamete donor is not a parent. So if you're using a sperm donor, an egg donor, an embryo donation, those folks are not parents, which gives protection to the donors, right? That they don't have those rights and responsibilities, and to the parents or parent that you are the parent, right? And that parent by intent, by conduct, by choice, not because of just a default into a biological relationship. So I think that's a really important aspect to the law that can bring some greater peace and stability for those families. The Parentage Act has a really clear statement of non-discrimination, right? Rhode Island law does not discriminate based on marital status, gender of parents, or the circumstances of your birth, which I think is a really powerful statement of public policy. Obviously, the Rhode Island Parentage Act establishes really clear protections and guidelines if you're building your parentage through surrogacy. Also another provision is there's really now statutes about how to protect your children if you're born through assisted reproduction, right? So if you consent to assisted reproduction with the intent to be a parent, you are a parent of your child. And you can show that consent through signing a legal document such as a VAP, or you can also have access to the courts to get a court decree of parentage, which is a different route to court than through the adoption codes. So you don't need to do a home study. You don't need to do an extensive criminal record check. There are fewer barriers to getting that court decree of parentage that's going to be recognized in every jurisdiction. So those are just a few highlights. Obviously, there's 10 substantive articles, 50 pages. There's a lot going on in this law, but I think that those are just some of the things I want to highlight. And also highlight that there is an FAQ about all of the different ways to be a parent on the GLAAD website, which I'm sure someone will probably put in the chat, which actually reminds me of one provision I did not discuss, which actually was already in Rhode Island law, which was de facto parentage. That if you can establish your de facto parentage of your child, which is essentially through your conduct, through your substantial caretaking of a child, through a number of a significant period of time. If you meet the factors of that test, you can also be established as a legal parent. But again, that's been a protection actually in Rhode Island since 2000, but this statute codifies that case and that protection. So those are just a few highlights that I wanted people to know about.
Thank you, Polly. And, maybe it would be helpful just to reiterate what day does the new law go into effect, and what can LGBTQ families do now to secure their children?
Absolutely. Goes into effect January 1, 2021. So Happy New Year. And I know that as of that date, hospitals will have the VAP forms. So those forms will be available. If you have an older child and you want to secure your parentage through a VAP, you can also do that by making an appointment at the Center for Vital Statistics, Vital Records. So I know that particularly those forms will be ready to go as of January 1. And then obviously, the courts will need to implement the new causes of action under the statute as well. But January 1, the law is up and running. And I'm sure there will be issues with the law, right? I mean, there always will be. No law is perfect. I'm sure the rep can attest to that, right? Sometimes tweaks are needed, but it's really a substantial step forward.
Great, thank you, Polly. So I wanted to just open it up now to all the folks who are tuning in, whether you want to use the chat box or whether you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question about any of these issues, or even just share your own experience. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, my name is Kelly. Hi, Julie. Thank you for doing this. And Jill let us know that you were doing it, so we hopped on. This is Maverick. He was born in May. He was born 3 months early. He's just really pumped to get out and into the world, but he's doing really well now. And I had heard from Julie that this was going on. We were following it really, really closely because we knew we were going to be really close to the deadline on this. And I guess I have a couple of questions. The first is when we were in the hospital, we were able to fill out the form and put both my wife and my name on it. I'm not sure if that's just because we have the same last name, because we're married. I'm not really sure. I also was changing his diaper at one point during this, so I might have missed something. And then my second question is what we would have to do. I don't know if that means we do have to go to the Center for Vital Statistics, or what we have to do as parents to a little guy that was born a half a year ago.
Great question, Kelly. So glad you're here. Welcome, Maverick. Yay. So this is not, I mean, and for anyone who has a really specific question, I would encourage you to contact Glad Answers. I'm going to just kind of give some basic legal information as opposed to specific legal advice on a Zoom call. So there, really great point, Kelly. It's really, there is a difference between being born into a marriage and being born to unmarried parents. So there is a marital presumption in Rhode Island law already, which has been interpreted to apply to LGBTQ families, right? So a child born into a marriage is the child of both spouses. But as Denise alluded to, the best protection for LGBTQ parents where that presumption might not be recognized in other jurisdictions, or because because of the lack of a biological connection, the best advice is to really get yourself some belts and suspenders, which is a court decree of parentage or something that's the equivalent of a court decree. So that could be, and under the new law, that could be, you can still do an adoption. You can get a court order of parentage under the assisted reproductive technology statutes, or you can sign a voluntary acknowledgement of parentage, which is the equivalent of a court decree. So even so post this bill, married and unmarried people can sign a VAP. And what you would probably do for married people, right? Because you're a parent on two grounds, right? You're a marital parent and and you have other paths, is to say, sign a VAP and get a certified copy of that and keep that with you, right? Because one of the things I always do as an LGBTQ parent myself, I keep copies of everything wherever I go, right? I have my marriage certificate, my birth certificate, the adoption decree, not my birth certificate, my children's birth certificates. And I travel with all of those documents. And these days you want to add that to that pile, a certified copy of your voluntary acknowledgement of parentage. I hope that answers that question, and happy to talk with you offline, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
And there's a question in the chat. I want to make sure to get to these questions in the chat. From Donnie, who asks, are there remaining issues that need to be addressed that the new law does not address? Really interesting question.
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, there's always work to be done. I mean, I think one of the really exciting things about this law is, like, Rhode Island did pass the full Uniform Act, which every state is a little bit different, because every state's a little different, so you've got to tweak it. But there are protections for assisted reproduction, there are protections for surrogacy. Rhode Island did include Article 9 of the UPA, which is about donor information, so that donor-conceived children can have access to non-identifying medical information of their gamete donor. So Rhode Island's passage was pretty comprehensive. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, now, that is not to say that it solved every LGBTQ or equality and parentage issue, but I think this law was pretty thorough.
Very thorough, very thorough. For Polly set the groundwork for any amendments that need to happen, any future issues.
Yeah, and then again, I'm sure there are. I mean, I know from working with child support, right? There's some like technical tweaks. Well, oh gosh, it'd be clearer if it said this instead of that. So I think those issues might come up.
Thank you. How about other questions that people tuning in might have? And feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat.
Hey everyone, this is Meredith. I have another question for Polly. This stems, I think, from our general sense of anxiety about, you know, despite what I would call favorable result of the November election. We were actually in the hospital right after the birth of our son when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and since then have been increasingly anxious about the landscape of LGBT rights, in the future of this country. And so I guess my question is about the voluntary acknowledgement of parentage and the distinction between that and the formal adoption decree. And, whether there is, I know you're not an oracle, Polly, but you do know a lot of things, but whether there, is a risk that families like ours might take in choosing one path over another path in the event that legal rights for LGBTQ families take a hit at the federal level.
Really good question, Meredith. And I just want to acknowledge what I think is a lot of parents are feeling super anxious these days, right? I mean, how can you not? But I do feel, well, first of all, I know that we will be fighting back any effort to scale back on marriage equality, parentage equality, right? Like there's many organizations and people out there who will fight tooth and nail to make sure that our families and all families are protected and that every child has access to the security of legal parentage, right? Because that is their right and their due. In terms of paths to parentage and what's most secure, I mean, I think, there is a US Supreme Court case, VL versus EL, right, that clearly says, which is about an LGBTQ family, right? They got an adoption in Georgia, and then they moved and broke up in, I think it was Alabama. And the birth mother tried to say that the other mother wasn't a legal parent and that not to recognize that adoption. And the US Supreme Court said, nope, under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, you have to recognize the court decree of another state, right? So that adoption had to be recognized. So that's why people say really an adoption decree is the kind of the gold standard of protection. I do also think that a judicial decree, like for instance, if you go in and get a judicial decree under the ART provisions, a court decree should also get that recognition. VAPs under federal law is the equivalent of a court decree of parentage, right? 10 states now do have expanded access to VAPs, and I think that's an expanding right that I hope continues to move throughout the United States. So, and again, anybody who wants to challenge that, obviously, I think there'll be many people to be there to fight back on it. So, I think that one of the things I like about the new law is that there's options, right? You have essentially 3 options for how to protect your family. I think I think that my hope is that that they should all be very secure. But there is a US Supreme Court case about adoption specifically.
I had a question. My partner and I are unmarried, also a personal choice. Maybe that won't be the case forever. Who knows? But so she works, her job covers her health insurance and her, our son, who's her biological son. This guy, I gave birth to, and we're covered under right care because I'm underemployed right now. And I was just wondering if there's any indication about how, healthcare is impacted once we sign the VAPs.
Thank you for that. Polly, what are your thoughts?
So Jen, are you the sole legal parent for your child at this point?
Yes.
Yep. So that would implicate your healthcare situation. So you should feel free to reach out to Glad Answers and we can touch base about that offline.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, we have a few more minutes if anyone else has questions out there on the chat, or unmute yourself. And if not, I had a quick question for the panelists. Why do you think it took so long? You know, in some ways, I feel like this is such a cutting edge bill, and we're joining states that have already done this. But you know, in others, I feel like, wow, why did it take so long to update these parentage laws from the 70s?
So, you know, what's interesting about this is that, you know, anytime we would, as we were trying to advocate around this and we would start telling our stories, folks who this doesn't impact just hadn't ever thought about it. They had no awareness that second parent adoptions were a thing unless they had a close relative or close friend who had gone through this. They were usually flabbergasted when we would lay out like what we'd have to go through to really secure our family's rights. And then they're just, I think a huge piece of it was just not that, and which is always sort of funny when you're sort of within LGBTQ community, that you know this is a thing that that you would have to deal with. Like I can't even remember when I found out. I've known for decades that that's what has to happen. And so I think it just took all of us talking loudly and to as many people as we could about it repetitively to build this momentum. I don't know if other people have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of talking, so Anna, I want to encourage you to cut me off. But I also think that some of these systems that have been in place for 40 years, right? It's hard to change systems, right? I mean, institutions are inert, and it requires a lot of work to make change like this, right? Which is one of the reasons I have to really, you know, kind of applaud the Office of Child Support and Vital Records for just like wanting it, right? Wanting it and wanting to make it happen, because I mean, they often saw, I know that they would say one of the things that troubled hospital workers is what Anna talked about, that the law in Rhode Island had been that a child born to an unmarried woman, she didn't have a choice of what to name her child. She had to give the child her last name, right? Which is arguably unconstitutional, but and how this happened all the time. Like women, like people wanted to give their child a different last name, right? Of the other partner or whatnot, and they simply couldn't do it. In any event, so that's one of the things I loved about Rhode Island is some of those institutions were just right there with the families and with the advocacy community. I mean, like this is just outdated and wrong. But I think it's hard to change. Sometimes it's very hard to change those outdated systems.
That makes sense. So anyone else, I want to just open it up one last time for anyone who wants to jump in with a question before we begin our wrap up here. What was the latest that anyone stayed giving testimony, waiting to give testimony, I wonder?
In 2018, it's hard for me to say because I was there for another bill, and for that one I was there till 12:30. I think I finished testifying on this one that night at 10:30, and it was about the end of my first trimester, and I hadn't really eaten much in a while, and I was very nauseous. And I at the time, I guess he would have been 5 or 6 year old sitting there next to me. So yeah, that was a really long night, but there were other ones as well.
As the time went on, we got to be expert level about it. Like we'd come with snacks, toys, bubbles, things for the kids. Like we would like camp out. Man, we got it down. That first year was rough. We stayed way too late and everyone was dehydrated and tired, but we got it down after that. It was really late nights though.
I still remember your muffins at one of the last hearings, and I think I was really hungry, and you had brought an entire spread of food. Yes, which was.
I was in the feed the people mode, keep the movement. They need food, feed. Yeah.
And I just have to thank you now. I know that you're in the front lines of the COVID pandemic in Rhode Island, and I mean, I can't believe you took the time to show up here today and all of your work to, you know, keep promoting this and keep educating people when you are really doing so much. So thank you. And thanks to everybody who's doing that
my
work.
pleasure. Who thought that we would finally be here doing this? This is awesome. You kidding me? Could do this all the time. We worked hard for this Zoom call.
You're right. You're right. You did.
In all of the grief and disconnection there's been this year and isolation and stuff, the signing in July was a highlight of this year for me. And was outside, we couldn't all hug each other, but we kind of waved at each other and we got it done. And it was an amazing moment. I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah.
After you guys all left, Eli wanted to chalk draw some more, and I completely stressed Sarah out to do this on public property, but we wrote in really big letters, we did it. And that honestly was one of the highlights of my year. I printed that out. It's on my wall.
I put it on my screen.
Really?
There it is, Wendy.
There it is. There's my little man right there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. It says we did it we did chalk, and Eli's taking his little trains, and because obviously these are not letters, these are all just tracks, right? And so he's taking his tracks and just going around. It's the highlight.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, there you have it, folks.
Yep. And thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Stephen Brown, the ACLU, and all the organizations and everybody who worked so hard, because it was 100% team effort. So anyway, thank you.
So I'll resound that and just say I had to thank you to everyone that worked towards this, and thank you all for joining us for this session. Once again, we'll be sending out an email with the video and the resource links attached. And enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.